자, okay. Okay, could you get my microphone on? Is it on now? Before we start the roundtable, I have a sort of housekeeping announcement. Somebody must have left the cell phone, a really nice Samsung cell phone. Looks a lot better than Japanese, but it's on the, don't videotape this. We haven't started it. It's left on the chair right there. Does this belong to anyone in this room, or I'll take it to the Secretariat office? No one? Okay, then, so it'll be in the Secretariat office, so just in case. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's about time we should start the roundtable. And I'm a moderator, the coordinator of this roundtable, Masaaki Sakamaki, and thank you for joining us. And we have wonderful panelists for this roundtable on internet policy. And as you know, IP-based services are deployed to most of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, of course, around the globe. And of course, they are serving as the infrastructure of the society and the industry. And one of the most critically important issues is undoubtedly internet governance. The world community, including industry, civil society, government, and user groups, discussing the key issues such as the management of critical internet resources and the regulations of information transmitted over internet. And as you know, ITU hosted the WCIT, or WICET, World Conference on International Telecommunications, just last month. And at first, I'd like to announce that the person who is hosting on behalf of ITU, Mr. Johnson, is kindly here as an audience. So I hope that you're aware that you could ask him to. And we have really wonderful experts from around the world. And since we have really many people, so rather than I introduce them, but could you kindly do self-introduction from Toru, and then Toru will start the presentation, 5 to 10 minutes each, and then I think we go into the discussion and interactive discussion with the audience too. So. Thank you for your cooperation. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Mr. Sakamaki, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toru Nakaya. I'm head of Research Institute of Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications. Well, I used to be responsible for ITU, but it's not in the case now. However, I'm still responsible for the follow-up of World Summit on Information Society. So I sometimes participate in United Nations conference. And I'm also supporting and assisting ITU team of the ministry temporarily, because now the director on ITU is left. And as I was given only 1 minute to speak during the morning session, maybe
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay. So I'll make some lengthy presentation at the beginning of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Rashid Shahfi. I'm a private telecommunications consultant in Washington, D.C., but I wear many hats. Principally, I am the chairman of the board of directors of the SIP Forum. That's the Session Initiation Protocol, which is the basis for basically all voice over IP between carriers on planet Earth, also in the enterprise as well. I'm also a member of the Federal Communications Commission's Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, which is a technical advisory board to the FCC. And we'll go from there.
I'm John Curran. I'm the president and CEO of ARIN, the American Registry for Internet Numbers. We are the Internet Number Registry. We coordinate IP addresses for Canada, US, and 25 economies in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. We're one of 5 regional registries. Paul Wilson from APNIC is also here, one of the 5 RIRs. I myself am the CEO. I've been involved in running one of the earliest internet providers, BBN. I've run a nationwide fiber-based provider, XO. I've run a hosting company. I founded ARIN as an industry association based on being able to manage these numbers and make sure they're available to organizations to need IP addresses to connect customers. I did that in 1997. Now ARIN has 4,000 members, and we coordinate IP addresses throughout our region. And we're part of the internet system, and I'll talk a little bit about that more later, but the RIRs collectively work with ICANN to do coordination, and then we work with partner organizations such as the Internet Society in terms of being able to coordinate our approach to internet governance matters. It should be a very good panel.
I'm Robert Pepper. I'm Vice President for Global Technology Policy at Cisco. And I joke sometimes that after almost 19 years at the FCC, I'm a recovering regulator. You know, and I look in the mirror every morning and say I'm a regulator, but I haven't regulated today. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm Rashid Shahfi. I am from Multinet, Pakistan. Multinet, Pakistan is an ISP as well as it's a long-distance international company. We also have the fiber all over the country, touching 109 cities. Basically, what I have discussed with the moderator, I'll dwell upon the issues that Pakistan is currently facing due to the governance of internet.
Okay, I'm Murai from Keio University, Japan. I started to work on the first TCP/IP code on the Unix box in Berkeley software distribution things, working at the Berkeley. So very much from the first stage of the internet I've been involved. And also from today's topic, probably I was one of the first one who earliest adopter of internet policy thing, because you know, I was in charge of the you know, the discussion between ITF and ITF ISOC and WIPO, talking about the intellectual property things on the domain name system. Since then, I've been serving the initial ICANN board and the ISOC board and the other things. So now I'm still working with the operations side of the internet, like root server advisory committees group I'm chairing now. So, hope a good panel discussion.
Thank you. My name's Paul Wilson. I'm the head of APNIC, which is, as John Curran, my colleague here, mentioned, the Regional Internet Registry for the Asia Pacific, responsible for the allocation and management of IP addresses throughout the region. So those are the numeric addresses that underlie the internet's infrastructure, not the domain names, the .com names and so forth, but the numeric addresses which are managed according to the specific system of regional internet registries and the number resource organisation that John Curran introduced. It's really a great pleasure, and I think quite significant to be here at what I think is the first PTC session dedicated to internet governance. So thanks very much to Masaaki-san for putting the effort in to make this session happen. I really think that there's potentially a sort of a gap or a bridge to be built between the traditional telecommunications industry players, the voice and data and satellite companies, and the ecosystem of internet organisations, and including the internet service providers, small and large, and content providers, on this issue of internet governance, because the internet has become such a critical might I say, a critical application of the telecommunications infrastructures which are being built in forums like the PTC. It's really more or less the only application that exists today, and it's an application whose economy, I was amazed to read last year, was valued at some $4 trillion in the G20 alone, putting the internet economy itself into the G20. And that research by the Boston Consulting Group projected an increase to $6 trillion by 2016, making the internet economy larger than Germany's. So I think as all of us working together on the telecommunications infrastructure side of things and on the internet as the primary application of that entire infrastructure, I think it's really important for us to be coming together and talking about this issue of internet governance, which is kind of a new term in a sense, a very important one because, as I say, of the value of the internet to society globally these days. I'd like to talk today as the session goes on about some of the structures and systems that are in place today to carry this concept of internet governance and to hope that this PTC community might become more engaged with those processes. The one primarily I'm talking about is the Internet Governance Forum, which was the outcome of a multi-year process at the United Nations through the World Summit on Information Society, which identified internet governance and the multi-stakeholder model for internet governance, created the Internet Governance Forum. And so aside from being here as the head of APNIC, I'm also a member of the multi-stakeholder advisory group for the Internet Governance Forum, and I'd like to talk a little more about that as the session goes on. But that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we should invite each panelist to speak 5 to 10 minutes each, and then we would go into discussion. And the first, Mr. Nakaya, he was, I don't know if he mentioned it, but he was senior advisor to the Secretary General of International Telecommunications Union for 5 years, 6 years.
Just for 2 years.
2 years.
That's 10 years ago.
But he's now in the organization that has quite a different view on the internet governance. So it'd be interesting to hear what he says. But anyway, he's closely following the ongoing internet governance debate. So he's the appropriate person to start out with. So thank you, and let's start it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sakamaki. Now, I'm going to introduce some of the international conference on internet governance, which has a global nature. This year, there are several meetings already planned. In particular, in the framework of the United Nations, let's say UNESCO will kickstart this meeting at the end of February in Paris. And ICANN will organize 2 meetings as usual, and ITU will organize 5th World Telecommunication Policy Forum in May in Geneva. And there's another framework already established, and the 3rd International Conference on Cyberspace will be held in Seoul. And Internet Governance Forum will organize 8th meeting in October. And eventually, the regular session of the United Nations General Assembly will also discuss some cyber-related issues in its debate. And I'd like to draw your attention that 3 of them will take place in Asian region. But we have to look forward. That means we have to look next year. And the next year, already more important conferences are planned, and at least 2. And one of them is this ITU's Plenipotentiary Conference. It will be held in Busan, Korea. And it will, in addition to electing high-level officials of ITU, it will revise ITU's constitution and the convention. And these 2 documents are ITU's basic documents and legally binding treaty. And these 2 documents defines ITU's mandate and defines member states' mandate on telecommunications. And the process will start. First, let me talk about the key issues. And these key issues related to internet will also be discussed in the framework of this Plenipotentiary Conference. And probably some of them could be proposed as a revised text for the Constitution and the Convention. So we'll have, again, the discussion on management of critical internet resources and also regulation on information transmitted over the network. And in particular, the participants will pay attention to who does this management or regulation and to what extent they will be involved. And the process for this conference will start shortly. And by mid-2013, each of the 6 regions will launch a series of regional preparatory meetings. And maybe in the latter half of this year, they will start submitting proposals to the ITU Secretariat. And in those proposals, we'll find some issues relating to the internet. And the other important meeting is working group on enhanced cooperation. Last month, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution, and which says it invites the chair of CSTD to establish a working group on enhanced cooperation. And the working group will be established by mid-2013, maybe April or May this year. And this working group will report to CSTD in May 2014. And CSTD will forward that report to the United Nations General Assembly. And maybe you don't know what CSTD is and enhanced cooperation is. So let me describe briefly about these 2 terms. First, CSTD stands for Commission on Science and Technology for Development. It's one of the commission of the United Nations Economic and Social Council and has 43 member states. And about 7 years ago, United Nations General Assembly Resolution 6252 tasked this commission to assist Economic and Social Commission in reviewing implementation of the outcomes of the World Summit on Information Society. So as a part of this reviewing activities, CSTD is now asked to establish the working group. Then I'll talk about the enhanced cooperation. This is clearly stated in the Agenda for the Information Society, adopted at the Tunis phase of the WSIS in November 2005. Just let me read out how they are written in this agenda. In the paragraph 69, it says, we further recognize the need for enhanced cooperation in the future to enable governments on an equal footing to carry out their roles and responsibilities in international public policy issues pertaining to the internet, but not in the day-to-day technical and operational matters. And paragraph 70 says, such cooperation should include the development of globally applicable principles on public policy issues associated with the coordination and management of critical internet resources. That means that these 2 issues will also be discussed in this working group in parallel with the preparation for the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference. That means that 2 big debates will happen this year and next year, in addition to those planned activities in the framework of United Nations. And what will happen in those 2 conferences? To think about this, we have to look back what happened during the WICIT 12. Before opening this conference, Dr. Toure, the Secretary General of ITU, emphasized that consensus is really important. He repeated that this conclusion of the conference should be adopted by consensus and requested member states participating in that conference to compromise so that they can reach unanimously in agreement. However, in the very last stage, a proposal came from an African group. And after, let's say, 5 or 6 hours discussion, they couldn't compromise. So based upon a proposal from a delegate, chair decided to take a vote. And as a result, 77 supported the proposal and 33 against. So finally, this one sentence shown in the middle of this slide was adopted. And then on site, let's say the very next day of this vote, a signing ceremony was conducted, and 89 states signed, but 55 states did not sign. So what we can learn from this consequence? Even Mr. Johnson said many member states tried to compromise so that they can reach agreement without vote. So actually, the text finally adopted at this wicked meeting was really moderate. There's no word on internet. There was nothing to do with control of flow of information over the internet. However, still, there's some conspiracy and there's some debate. So that means that many countries compromised. But actually, it doesn't fly because we have now 2 ITRs. If we don't have to agree on a single text, why member states have to compromise? That's what I think if I'm still a delegate of Japan attending at the Brainpot. So I want you to think about this, what will happen in the next 2 years without compromising our view. What can we do by reaching a consensus, or at least to reach some kind of sharing a single view at the global level? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a good job. And looks like you did better than when you worked for me. But anyway, no, I'm sorry, I'm joking. I'm envious, I want to say. I think all he said really is based on how we, the current core principles and philosophy that many of us in the free world think appropriate. There are multi-stakeholder, bottom-up, and self-regulated kind of notion. These are have come under close scrutiny by the different organization, and notably at ITU. So I think that would raise a lot of questions and discussions today. Anyway, let's go on to Mr. Shockey, who is the head of the SEVP forum, and I think Mr. Shockey has a different message from different perspective. So, please.
Thank you very much. In terms of internet governance and regulation, there has actually been some fairly interesting maneuvers by in the North American context, which may or may not have impact on internet governance, but it's worthwhile to sort of bring these to the forefront. This is traditionally more of a telecom-related issue, but it actually may have a relevance one way or the other. Both the United States Federal Communications Commission, which is the national regulator in the US, and the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, both have undertaken proceedings in the last 12 months to essentially formally turn off the time division multiplexing SS7-based public switch networks in their respective countries. Basically, most of us who've been around this arena for some time have heard about convergence. Well, not only have we moved beyond convergence, we're moving to actually flicking the switch and turning it off. This means no more TDM, no more SS7, a 100% IP communications network using SIP interconnection, not just for traditional telephony, voice, text, point-to-point video, but indeed there is a serious move to transition the entire emergency services networks of both countries to an all IP infrastructure. This would be the ES911 system in North America, But clearly the European regulators are looking at 112, moving it to all IP, basically relieving incumbent carriers of many of their responsibilities for database management, for alley databases, street databases, one way or the other. So what does this mean? This is, again, the intersection of internet governance and telecommunications governance at the same time. It is specifically talking about interconnection at this particular point on a domestic basis. In the United States, this is known as 251, which is how does an existing carrier such as AT&T directly interconnect over IP-based networks to a Comcast or a T-Mobile or a rural carrier, and under what terms and conditions. Does this transition, which is now very consensus-based between the operators and the regulator, does this complicate issues involving internet governance? And so are we really just talking about a transition to IP technology? Does this have anything to do with, quote unquote, the internet, whatever that ultimately means? And I'll be willing to take definitions of what the internet really is. But this is actually relatively important for all of us who traditionally come out of the voice communications world, not to mention data as well. So this is the issue I'd like to raise, and as we keep talking about it, we'll dive into it further. John?
Sure, thank you. Please.
Good afternoon. So I said I'd come back and talk a little bit about the internet ecosystem, and I will do exactly that. The fact of the matter is that we all know what the internet is, and we all know that it's held together with IP addresses, which are the endpoint identifiers used to connect equipment. The internet protocol has been around some time. The earliest networks, the ARPANET, MILNET, terrestrial wideband, actually there's a long list of them, CSNet, NSFNet, eventually culminating in commercial networks in the early 90s. These networks all use the internet protocol, and we coordinated the identifiers, the numbers, the IP addresses. The IETF did that and then worked with various US government contractors to make sure that if you needed unique addresses, you could get unique addresses to grow your network. And we've continued that model. In fact, we distributed the function with both in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific regions with establishment of regional registries. We then did the same thing with ARIN, and then with Latin America and with Africa with the establishment of regional registries, leading to 5 regional registries which handle the coordination and management of IP addresses. A few years ago, someone noted that the internet was remarkably successful, and I said, yeah, it's very successful, and it's been enabled by the administration of these IP addresses. If you need IP addresses, you go to your registry and get them. And they're provided to all service providers on the same terms. And service providers work to set the policies by which we number them. And someone said, well, it's been so successful, in fact, that it's an internet governance challenge. And I said, an internet governance challenge? I didn't know what that meant, actually. I had to go ask someone, what was internet governance? Because I knew what IP address administration was. We had been doing it for decades. And the internet was successful as a result. But internet governance, suddenly someone told me, no, these are critical internet resources. And I was like, wow, critical internet resources sound to me like fiber and spectrum, but I guess maybe if someone tells me that IP addresses are critical internet resources, sign me up. I guess they are. There's an old proverb. Success has many fathers. Failure is an orphan. And we have that situation. We actually have a successful internet, so a lot of people want to help in the administration of the internet. So when we talk about internet governance, one of the first questions we have to ask is, what needs to be governed? What truly is an administrative issue, and what truly is a governance question? Governance questions often have to do with common values and public policy positions that governments have decided are important, to the point where they're going to affect the rules. They're going to regulate your behavior because there's a public policy imperative that requires we regulate something. We're doing it for the better good. But all of the internet numbers and administration of that come out of the original principles of the IETF, which is we're trying to keep it running. We do the administration necessary to make sure that the network stays operational and grows. It's not a public policy issue any more than it's a public policy issue whether or not the screws in the chairs that you're sitting in are a certain size. Someone makes the chairs and they can decide the screws to use. You make a network, you can decide what technology to use. It's not a public policy question. So the issue of internet governance is actually very interesting because you have to decide yourself, is it really governance? A lot of what is happening in the internet is technical administration. It's choosing that we're going to use port 80 for web, and we're going to use 443, and we're not going to use any others. Or we're going to use port 25 or 525 for email. And I'm not sure there's a governance question there, as much as it's making sure that we use unique numbers in unique ways. So the ARIN, one of the 5 RIRs, and the other RIRs work together to make sure you all have unique numbers. And we're going to continue to do that, and you'll provide us input as to how big the blocks should be and who should get them and what those criteria are. And we're going to go to the slide that was up earlier that has all those meetings. And we're going to work with the people who want to help us, because apparently in this administration we have governance issues as well. And we ask your support in helping us not be over-governed. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we go on to Dr. Pepper first?
Yeah.
But I'd like you to maybe wrap up at the end, but could you kindly address Cisco's view on ongoing debate?
Well, sure. I think, John just made a really good point, which is there's this question, and if you listen to each of the speakers, right, internet governance means a lot of different things to different people because the internet has been so successful. I want to go back to the, my opening quip about, being a reformed regulator. The internet did not happen by accident. There were some conscious decisions made by some, engineers and technical people to design a network. They developed, TCP/IP. It was deployed outside of traditional regulatory structures. The fact that the internet was not regulated as telecom also was not an accident. It was the result of some very conscious decisions that were made in the 1980s and early 1990s. All right? So, we then, as a result of that, had an ecosystem develop in which there were different participants, including government players, academics, researchers, private industry, and none of the various players in the development and evolution of the internet, none of the players dominated the process. It was, we didn't know it at the time, but it's what we now call a multi-stakeholder process. It was bottom up. It was organic. Anybody could participate. Anybody, you just had to show up. And you could develop new services and applications in a process that was a consensus process. And the technical part of that was being driven by the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which if any of you have not attended an IETF meeting, is an interesting process. The ITU standards process that Malcolm talked about this morning is also a consensus process, right? People, technical engineers get together, they work in study groups, the study groups, work towards consensus, but it's a fairly structured process that's fairly formal. The IETF, when the rapporteurs for the various groups come to what they believe is consensus, they ask the group to hum. Right? And if everybody hums in consensus, then you move on to the next issue. Right? And for people whose lives live in Malcolm's world, That sounds kind of weird, right? It's different. But it's very parallel, and it's actually not all that different because it's consensus-based. But it is, in fact, a very open process. Over the years, that has led to the internet as we know it, which the previous panelists have, all agreed, and everybody does it. The internet is important, leads to GDP growth. We all depend on it. And because it's so successful, everybody wants a piece of it. So the question going forward is, we can come back to some of the specific governance issues. How do we maintain the success without the unintended consequences of regulation? What do I mean by that? Sometimes, and this I go back to my opening, sort of joke, which was not really a joke, which is, I'm a recovering regulator, and there are a lot of regulators in the world who think that their job is to regulate because they're regulators. I never thought of that's what my job was when I was at the FCC, right? I always thought my job was to solve problems, right? And if there's a problem, then regulation is one of the tools available to solve a problem. But the first question you have to ask is there a problem? Or what's the problem you're trying to solve for? And if you can identify a problem, then you can ask what are the most appropriate tools. Sometimes it's government intervention, we call that regulation. At other times, it's government stepping back and not regulating, and the problem gets solved much more quickly. The other thing that we have to look at is the benefits and costs. Is the cure more painful or worse than the disease? Is the solution worse than the problem you're trying to solve? And again, those are the kinds of questions that we need to think about at a much higher level, which brings me to the wicket. There were a number of proposals that were made that, fortunately, as Malcolm pointed out this morning, never got into the final treaty. Through the discussion process, the negotiation process, the most harmful proposals never saw the light of day. And in part, that is because of the attempts at the consensus process. And it was clear, for example, that although there were some countries that want to regulate internet content, the consensus of the countries that were there, the delegations that were there, was that they did not want to regulate internet content. And in fact, there is specific language that says there will not be regulation of content. However, there are some proposals that are still very troubling. One proposal that remains troubling is a proposal, it's called Article 5B, which originally had language talking about spam. Spam is content. But because there was agreement there shouldn't be regulation of content, the word spam is not part of the treaty. Rather, member states are encouraged to work together to, I forget the exact word, Malcolm, to minimize or eliminate or bulk unsolicited electronic communications. Never uses the word spam. The concern with that is that, definitionally, what is bulk? You send me an email, that's not bulk. Send 2 emails, that's not. Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Is it 100,000? What is unsolicited? In the broadcasting world, we call that advertising. Who decides? Governments decide. Governments decide what is unsolicited communications. that opens the door to some member states using that as an excuse, perhaps, to regulate political speech. So, whether or not the intent was to not have regulation of content, there is language that was seen as regulating content, and that was very unfortunate. That provision by itself is not the end of the world. In fact, as Malcolm pointed out this morning, the final language was actually pretty good. It was pretty balanced, with some exceptions, and those exceptions led to 55 countries not signing the final at the final signing ceremony. One minor correction to the presentation at the beginning: the provision on access by member states to international telecommunication services, it was not at a suggestion of a delegate. It was a point of order requested by the Iranian delegate, and the chairman of the conference, who was fantastic as a chairman, tried to actually have a conversation about that, but the Iranian delegate said, you may not have any discussion on a point of order. And it forced a vote. The African proposal came from Sudan. Why? Because what they wanted to do was have the ITUs, ITRs, which are a technical document, supersede UN sanctions. This was about sanctions and putting the ITU in a very uncomfortable, and I would argue untenable position of having an ITU treaty supersede UN sanctions or other sanctions set out by other governments. That is not the role of the ITU. And by the way, the Secretary General and the chairman of the meeting, in my opinion, and watching the body language and what they were trying to do, did not want that to be the point of contention. Because once that was adopted, what you saw were many more countries declaring they would not sign because they could not sign in that context. And I think that was very unfortunate. And we can come back to more of these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Should we go on?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I may not disagree with the learned panelists, but the issue of governance is definitely there. The increased interest of the governments for the governance is very much there, because anybody who has an internet access is now a publisher. So if anybody can publish and openness is there, what is the limit of that openness? Is it a policy issue, or is the country's policy issue, or is the international issue? That, I think, is being debated in the ITU different council meetings. I believe there are two aspects of the internet governance which are relevant: is the content regulation and the technical administration. Technical administration, as the learned panelists said initially, that internet is inflicting the revenues of the telecom operators. That's the LDI, this long distance international, and the domestic telephony. So this is a gray area which needs to be attended by the superior bodies, and those are under discussion, but still it's in gray. Everybody is losing the revenue. The other issues are the identification of all internet users. Thus, user anonymity is lost. sharing and retention of internet usage data between the governments, national and country-based regulation of internet. These are the issues, I think, which has not reached to any consensus so far. Pakistan, since I belong to Pakistan, I'll just dwell on a few things. Pakistan has blocked access to websites critical to the government or military. As you know, Pakistan is confronted with war on terror. There are contents from time to time on the internet which are not safe for the citizens. Not citizens of Pakistan, but the citizens of the world. Because majority of the Pakistan internet traffic is routed through internet exchange, they are able to monitor the contents and they can enforce the firewalls there, blocking the internet contents. In this way, a lot of revenue is being lost by the continuous imposition of the content. With the real content, some other contents are also blocked. There are a few examples of censorships in Pakistan. In 2006 September, specific online cartoon website banned cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. YouTube was blocked in Pakistan following a decision taken by the Pakistan Telecommunications Authority in February 2008 because number of non-Islamic objectionable videos are there. In May 2010, on Everybody Draw Muhammad Day, again blocked the website in a bid to contain blasphemous material. The ban was lifted on 27th May 2010 after the website removed the objectionable content from its servers at the request of the government. On 19th and 20th May 2010, PTA imposed a ban on Wikipedia, YouTube, Flickr, and Facebook in response to a competition entitled Everybody Draw Muhammad Day on Facebook. In September 2012, the Pakistani government blocked the video sharing website YouTube for not removing an anti-Islamic film made in some country. Innocence of Muslims, which mocks Muhammad. The website will remain suspended. It is stated that until the film is removed, they are not going to open the website. So if content is not an issue, why we need to block this? If we need not to block this, then we look for the governance. And we look forward for the governance. The governance should happen. Internet is not one country's commodity now. It's an international commodity. Everybody is using. So it has to be governed by the international body. I fail to understand the ITU. ITU is pushing a lot of efforts on that. ITU has participation of all member states. They have the participation of the sector members like industry, like we are the sector member of the ITU. They have the participation from the academia. So when they have everything, it's not, I don't think so, it's a rocket science that we can have a good governance model to be agreed. I think later than sooner, it will happen. With this, I move on to you, sir.
Okay. Let me talk a little bit about the technology side of the internet. Then, because listening to all the talks and about the governance of the internet, and then probably we should really understand what Robert said the problems, but what the problems are in front of us from the internet, and because I said that because there is a lot of levels of the internet. So in the morning session, I raised what is the definition of the internet in here, and then because the internet started with things called the internet protocol, Internet protocol is basically the logical definition how the digital data is going to be delivered to all over the world and every single computer and globally. That's basically the mechanism we are talking about, the Internet protocol. So the important thing is that below the Internet protocol, there is a technology like a spectrum allocation and the radio, optical fiber, and et cetera. So various kind of means to carry that digital data. Then, on top of the Internet protocol, there is a lot of a way of transmission and the application things. So that's the architecture of the Internet. So when we are talking about the global Internet, then one of the definition is to talk about the IP network around the world, and then properly operated and for the entire human being and their life. And then, in fact, the life of the human being is basically solving a lot of problems on top of that particular Internet based on the IP. But there is a lot of issues on our activities utilizing that particular IP-based network. And then we sometimes call the activity itself application as the Internet. And so the regulation, when we are talking about the regulation and the policy decision on the operation of the Internet, then so the first thing that we have to be clear is which part of the Internet we are talking about, and what's going to be the problems, and what's going to be the solution. That's probably what we have to discuss. And then, so to me, the various discussion is not always focusing on the specific problems we are facing to. Therefore, it's going to be kind of leading us to failure if we don't have a kind of common problems to share, and then talking about the different solutions for each of the problems, and then we're going to end up with a kind of a failure of the solutions. So it's very difficult to move forward. So, but fortunately, we do have a lot of issues in front of us. So problems. I mean, so the infinity of problems are relating to the space of the information society now. And but one more thing I'd like to add is the recent technology trend on the internet space. Okay, I'm doing the standardization way of 4K broadcasting transmission, 8K broadcasting transmission, which is basically the 16 times more data for the video transmission of today on the internet. So if you are looking the internet traffic very carefully, the increasing number of video traffic, including the YouTube and other things, but important thing is that if we are passing the last year at the Olympic time, then we tested the 8K video transmission from London to Tokyo. That's a huge amount of traffic. And then it certainly would share the infrastructure we are using today. And then that's a broadcasting business utilizing the internet. So it's certainly the kind of distinguish between the broadcasting business and the internet business. And from the other view is the Internet of Things. Internet of Things, it's connecting the things instead of connecting human being. But one of the examples I'd like to share with you today is the automobile industry. Automobile has more than 100 of sensors to access, to be shared. And then with the internet, their requirement, I'm serving as a global agenda chair for the Davos, Global Economic Forum. So on the future of the internet, and then peeling with the future of the transportation group, and their requirement about the future of the internet is what's going to be to support the automobile safetyness on the year 2025. Okay, that was the question. So the answer is that it's a use of the spectrum, the reliable communication things. Otherwise, the personal vehicle cannot survive on the surface of the Earth. Okay, so that's a new way of communication. So then, our discussion started from the telecommunication. Okay, the telecommunication started with analog and turned out to be digital. Digital is exchange and sharing of the digit. And then, so digital information, if there is some failure in between, there could be a way of a retransmission of the thing. So we can send exactly the same thing if the communication is failed. So that's basically the mechanism of the internet and the other digital communication things. Now, so the telecommunication regulation prototype was discussed based on the analog communication things on the telephone thing. Now, we are talking, our application is automobile industries, the new way of vehicles to support our life, and then also any kind of broadcasting, the message transmission. So various kinds of things. Probably the health record and the medical operations, and then the doctors remotely can help people's life. And then now we care about the latency. The original internet technology didn't care about the latency of the communication, right? Go and back. Now we need a real-time interaction for the medical operation of the global basis. So the target is to achieve the global communication way with probably internet protocol is so far it's usable, and there is a technology advancement around that. And then we really need for the global information society things, and then we really need to keep this under running and then accommodating the new applications. That's from the technical side. Now, then going back to policy side of the discussion. So now what kind of issues we want to focus on to solve, and then inviting the related stakeholders to solve that issue. That's basically the process. And so I sincerely hope that the entire discussion, WCIT and the other ITU-related discussion, but we all in this room is going to be responsible for the future of the information society, right? And then we all be responsible for how to solve the issues generated from the advancement of the technology in an entire human being. So that's basically what I wanted to share. The Paul?
Thanks, Jim. It's just occurred to me that the internet is, by one measure at least, just over 30 years old this year. The IPv4 was adopted for the internet from January the 1st, 1983. So 30 years is a fairly long time, and the next significant anniversary came about 10 years later with the initiation of the World Wide Web, which turned up in the early 1990s. And it's actually now a full 10 years since the dot-com crash. So the internet's kind of getting pretty mature in the scheme of things. In order for there to have been a dot-com crash, the internet needed to be pretty big at the time, and it's actually grown a huge amount since then. I think probably the dot-com crash was one of the triggers for internet governance becoming an issue that was then on the radar of governments. It appeared about the same time. It came up through this United Nations conference, an ITU conference called the World Summit on the Information Society, which was a major international event actually in two phases. It went over 4 years with two major conferences in Geneva and Tunisia. And it was that conference was all about getting the best benefits out of new technologies for the development of the information society, the post-industrial society. And it didn't even start with anything much about the internet on its agenda. But during that first phase, it was in 2002, 2003, the idea of internet governance came up as the conference started to focus really on the critical role that the internet itself played, not just ICTs in the information society, but actually the internet. And so, you know, it's pretty reasonable, I think, that internet governance would come up as a term that is encompassing the question of how the internet actually came to be and how it's being managed and how it can be best managed for best effect. The end of the first phase of WSIS came up with something called the Geneva Declaration, which said that the management of the internet encompasses both technical and public policy issues and should involve all stakeholders and relevant intergovernmental and international organisations. So that was actually the seed of what was called the multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance. It wasn't the invention of multi-stakeholder approach, because actually that approach had existed since 1983 and before. It was merely the identification of something that actually, certainly in that context particularly, needed to be identified. That is in the UN type context, I mean. So that was a pretty important set of events, and so the WSIS phase one ended, and it ended with this Geneva Declaration, which also called for internet governance to be looked at in more detail. And in the second phase, there was something called the Working Group on Internet Governance, and I think Masaaki-san was one member of that group. It was a group of experts who were called together to actually explore and look at internet governance as a concept, to define it, to provide the second round of the WSIS meeting with some inputs on internet governance, and it did that. It created a working definition of internet governance. Had a lot of debates about the so-called narrow definition of internet governance, which actually included the so-called critical resources of IP addresses and so forth, versus the broader definition. And what was chosen eventually was the broader definition of internet governance. So this very exhaustive process involving a large group of experts and a lot of deliberation came up with this working definition of internet governance, which defined it as the development application by governments, the private sector and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. A very broad definition, really encompassing the breadth of the internet itself, the fact that the internet touches every aspect of life, and its governance, therefore, really encompasses every stakeholder in it and every person who may have a say of whatever type in how it's developed and managed. So that second phase of WSIS took another 2 years, and it deliberated on quite a number of things, including internet governance. It adopted the multi-stakeholder approach quite formally as the preferred mechanism for carrying out processes of internet governance, and it also finally called for the creation of a new structure, the Internet Governance Forum, to carry forward the discussions of internet governance under that broad definition of governance and according to the multi-stakeholder process as it's defined. And that was pretty significant again. I mean, this is the outcome of a UN conference, an intergovernmental conference, which traditionally doesn't do this, but what it produced was this absolutely multi-stakeholder, broad, open set of principles and processes that really did encompass what people had learned through that process about the internet. And so the IGF was the next phase in this story, and the IGF is, as I say, a creation of the UN itself, but a very innovative creation. So that the IGF is an annual event. It's an open event, open to anyone and everyone, on about the scale of the PTC meetings. You know, 1,500, 2,000 participants in each of the IGF meetings that have happened annually so far. So there've been 6 meetings. They've been successful in terms of having increasing agendas, increasing levels of participation. They've been quite sort of unique and unusual again in the UN context, as in that they are not decision-making meetings. But what's said about the IGF is that while it's not a decision-making event, it's an event which decision-makers attend, and decision-makers attend IGF really in very, very large numbers. And that is a very significant thing. It's very significant to be bringing decision makers to a meeting, governmental representatives, as well as industry representatives, civil society, academics, researchers, individuals, activists of all kinds. So it is a multi-stakeholder space. It's a space in which people participate on an equal footing. And that too is an important part of the multi-stakeholder process. I think the IGF is extremely important, and it's going to be extremely important for as long as there are internet governance challenges to address. And I don't think anyone can quite see the end of that in the same way that we can't quite see the end of where the internet is going to take us in future. So rather than seeing the IGF as a sort of a compromise, which it was between a large number of different factors which were happening through the WSIS process, it is still one that is ongoing. It's a process that's actually extremely efficient as well. If you think of the scale of the internet economy, as I mentioned earlier, the IGF at the moment has a central secretariat budget of less than a couple of $1 million. And it's actually crying out for some help with that budget too, in that its initial funding came largely from governments, and yet the stakeholders who are participating in supporting, enjoying the benefits of the IGF are actually a much wider group, predominantly, and I say this here, very much including the industry of telecommunications organisations who are currently exploiting, building, profiting from the advent of telecommunications and the internet itself. So, as a final remark, I'd say to you, I think it does make sense that governments are not bankrolling the IGF. It makes sense that a multi-stakeholder process needs to be supported by all stakeholders who are buying into it, who have a stake in it. And I think in the second, we have a second renewed phase of the IGF going on at the moment. We really would like to see the IGF receiving a broader base of support and increasing support. So I would say to you, to all here in this room and in the PTC audience, that I would really hope to see you taking an interest in the IGF, in becoming fully committed to the IGF as the mechanism that will take the internet forward in a sustained, stable, realistic and expansionary way into the future. And I hope that you would both look at attending IGF meetings. The next one as we heard earlier, is coming up in Bali in the second half of this year, because this really is the best place for internet governance agendas, where the internet governance agenda is being explored and exhausted, properly exhausted in an international setting, considering the views of all of us that might be affected by future decisions about the internet, such as ones which were attempted but unsuccessfully taken in some cases at the Dubai meetings. That's all I've got at the moment, thanks.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, I got some questions, but most of them are answered already. And I'll just remind to you that you mentioned the IGF, but you know, in the second phase of the WSIS, it is the Japanese government that proposed the notion of IGF, and we did it. So okay. Anyway, this time, could we invite the Mr. Johnson, ITU Standardization Bureau Chief, who is present here kindly, to respond to all this discussion. Microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure we all found that an extremely interesting exchange of views, and it's very interesting that such a distinguished panel of experts, many technical experts, voiced the opinion that we don't really know what the internet is. There's no definition of what we mean by internet. And now, of course, that follows that we don't know what the internet is. We don't know what internet governance is. But wherever it is, there's a lot of member states that want to be part of it. Maybe if we could explain more clearly what we mean by internet governance, they may not be so interested. But at the moment, there's a clear drive for all member states to be involved in internet governance, and the only definition is what Paul referred to. Maybe it would be helpful if we could come up with a better understanding of what we mean by internet governance. Anyway, I assume I was asked to respond to the comments about the wicket in particular. And so just to pick up a couple of points I noted was, yeah, it's true that 89 countries signed the treaty immediately, you know, the next day after the text was finalized, and 55 didn't. I think one of the reasons why there was so many that didn't sign was the fact of this vote, you know, in the last minute on the inclusion of that sentence in the preamble that the treaty recognizes the right of member states to have access to the International Telecommunications Service. And because that was a late addition, many countries had got clearance, you know, many countries had got clearance back at Capitol to sign the treaty. But then that change occurred at the last moment. It meant they had to go back to Capitol again to get clearance. And with the time difference for many countries, it just wasn't possible to get clearance to sign. So it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be more countries committing themselves to the treaty, because as I mentioned, the previous treaty in Melbourne didn't get that many initially, but it ended up with 178 countries committed to it. So by the time it comes into force 1st of January 2015, hopefully there will be a lot more than the 89 countries signed up to it. But looking at the 2 points that Bob Pepper picked out as points of concern, Article 5B, it refers to spam. I mean, it doesn't use the word spam because spam's not defined. It refers to unsolicited bulk electronic communication. And those words were picked out of the ITU recommendation on countering spam. And the experts that developed that, it's obviously a technical standard on countering spam. They actually came up with that wording. You know, it wasn't government bureaucrats that came up with that wording. It was the companies involved in developing the standard. In the introductions, said there's no definition of spam, but we generally take it to mean unsolicited. It means that you didn't ask for it. Bulk means a whole load of it, and electronic communication. And the 5B says that member states should endeavor to prevent that, but in particular to reduce its impact on the International Telecommunications Service. And clearly spam has an impact on the International Telecommunications Service because of the effect on capacity, etc. So that's what 5B is. And then the preamble bit about recognizing the rights of member states to have access to international telecommunications. That, as you say, could be seen as sort of taking precedence over the UN sanctions. But the ITRs can't take precedence over that. And also the other thing is that ITRs, they can't take precedence over the Constitution, ITU Constitution. And Article 35 in the ITU Constitution gives member states the right to suspend international telecommunications with other member states. So even if a member state signed up to the ITRs, it wouldn't prevent a member state from stopping international communications with another member state. And it was Sudan, of course, in particular, that was pushing this. Just as a personal point of interest, I was in Khartoum recently and I visited Khartoum University, which has become an academic member of ITU. And they were complaining bitterly about the fact that their researchers can't get access to many websites which they need to be able to carry out their studies. So, you know, it's not just the government of Sudan that's getting affected, but it's the poor students in the universities in Sudan also. So I would hope that, you know, when governments reflect a bit more on this treaty, they'll see that there's a lot of good things in it, by the way. Perhaps I could quickly mention them again. There's the fact that it addresses mobile roaming, the need to make sure that customers know how much they're going to be paying when they roam. Also, it asks for a reduction in the cost of roaming. It promotes investments and competition. It calls for energy efficient use of standards. It calls for accessibility so that disabled persons have access to the telecommunications. It calls for cutting e-waste. Calls for cooperation on ensuring the security of the international telecommunications network. And the misuse of numbering, which is a big concern in this area, and also to have a global emergency number, or any country that doesn't use 112 or 911, they have to use one of those two globally agreed numbers in addition to whatever other number they're using. So there's a lot of good things in the treaty. And then the resolutions, there was 5 resolutions adopted. One is to endeavor to improve broadband
we ran out of time. So.
Yeah, for small island states. And another one on the ITU playing an active role in broadband and also the multi-stakeholder model of the internet. So multi-stakeholders are mentioned in this resolution. And it also asks for possible further revision of the treaty, possibly in 8 years' time. So we may be soon starting on a further round of revision of this treaty. And I think, if I could make one final point, Mr. Nakaya mentioned in his starting off that a lot of countries, you know, felt that they'd made a lot of compromises. They dropped a lot of the nasties, you know, they didn't get into the treaty because to reach consensus. And then in the end, these countries that, you know, they were trying to please by dropping all these things, turned around and said, well, we're not signing. So I think that is going to be a concern if we come to a revision of this treaty again in 8 years' time. These countries are going to say, why are we compromising if they're not going to sign at the end of it? So I think that has to be taken into consideration as well.
Thank you. We ran out of time, but I think we could extend 5 more minutes. Is it okay? I mean, since we have only dinner after this. So we are open for the questions and answers. Yes, sir.
I'm not familiar with the treaty, but my question is, does the treaty cover infrastructure projects? For example, I build submarine cables for a living. And what happens is, as I talk to different countries and they want a submarine cable connected to that country, but then there are restrictions. For example, the US will not allow an entrepreneur to build a cable to Iran or to Cuba and so on and so forth. And then depending on the different regions of the world, there are restrictions from one country to the other country. So does your treaty refer to this particular issue at all? And it's an open question.
So probably.
Out comes the expert.
If I do recall, there actually was one very interesting clause that those nation states that are essentially landlocked, that needed access to trans-Pacific or transatlantic cabling, could in fact exert a right. And I actually thought that that was a very good provision in terms of infrastructure. Yeah. It's the landlocked African and Latin American countries were actually quite insistent on this. And I think it's perfectly consistent with international law, custom, and practice for Peru or somebody needs to get to the ocean to get cabling. Yeah.
Could you kindly communicate maybe after the session, and can we go on to other questions? Sure, sir. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Yamakawa from PTC Japan Committee. And I was quite disappointed for the result of the Wicked 12 because as Professor Murai has pointed out, there are many issues in front of us to tackle with. For example, the internet governance problem is one of them. We have to cooperate for to provide to multi-stakeholder, for example, multi-stakeholder approach. Well, we support multi-stakeholder approach, but in order to maintain the multi-stakeholder approach, for example, we have to persuade developing countries to participate in the general top-level domain process. It is very important, I suppose. And other issues, for example, the cyber security issues is very important. We have some discussions about cyber resilient network and Davos on the WEF forum basis, and we need international cooperation. So there are many issues that we have to tackle with, and many issues need international cooperation, such as IPR basis, cyber security basis, and we need some platform. And I think ITU is one of the very important platform, but through the Wicked process, no compromise. So I don't think I can understand that some statement or a treaty might be leads to some regulations in some countries, but there are so many things that international cooperation is needed. So I hope that if any compromise is needed, and isn't it just impossible? So completely impossible. I don't think so. And so, well, I just want to hear about the frank opinion. Isn't it that impossible?
I don't know. It's a former Vice Minister Yamakawa. It's your opinion, right? Sure, please, sir.
So John Curran, ARIN. ARIN's a sector member of the ITU. We're a member of it, and we participated in the Wicked process. And there's a little bit of a challenge in that a multi-stakeholder process would presume all the inputs, everyone was free to participate. And the ITU made actually great strides with Wicked in opening up many of the documents so people could see them, and in having the webcast sessions. But that's not fully multi-stakeholder if there's documents that people can't see, or if there's sessions that people aren't invited to. And we had a little bit of that. A sector member is not a member state. A member state has a different set of privileges, some of them governed by the governing documents of the ITU, and so somewhat difficult to change. So we have a challenge in that if you want a multi-stakeholder dialogue for some of these issues, That is taking place, but some of those issues are being discussed at the IGF in a multi-stakeholder process, at ICANN when it comes to things like domain names in a multi-stakeholder process. The question that comes up is, there's a lot of issues here, a lot of things to be worked out in our global telecommunications system. Access of countries to fiber and landlocked countries and roaming agreements so that mobile roaming works are all very important. Those are also being discussed at the ITU. So the question is, we showed up, we had to be there because there were internet governance matters. But the reality is that those same governance matters are also being discussed at IGF and at ICANN. And the question is, when you ask, is there a compromise possible? Possibly, but it's also a question of how many meetings can we all attend every year?
So one of the...
Yeah, look.
Go ahead. Yeah, Malcolm pointed out the really good provisions, the positive steps forward as a result of, they're incorporated in the ITRs, the 2012 ITRs. And there were a lot of really important advances. Malcolm mentioned the issues with landlocked countries or others. There were a lot of compromises. And my point was that because of this last minute event and vote and provision, there were a lot of countries that had seen progress and that were going to sign, but because of that, they felt they could not under their national law, and or within Europe, the declaration from a council. There was a European, a council resolution. And, Malcolm's right. I mean, there are other provisions of the, Constitution that essentially override that provision in the preamble. But then the question is, well, so why is it there? I mean, there were some unfortunate things that happened at the end. There were a lot of compromises. And in fact, at one point, Malcolm actually had, I thought, an excellent proposed compromise language that there was an ad hoc meeting on the floor. Countries agreed that this was, and in fact, it was proposed by, I think it was the Secretary General proposed it, or maybe you did. The chairman was ready to accept it, but there were some member states that refused to. I mean, part of the problem was there was a lot of emotion. The further we get away from, the longer time we have from the first week in December, the emotion will dissipate. I fully expect that by the time we're in Geneva with the WSIS conversations in May, there'll still be some, but most of the emotion from December will have gone. I think that there are some people who are saying that we should defund the ITU. That's nuts. Totally disagree with that. Talk about being counterproductive. Again, I think that's the result of emotion, and that over time that again will dissipate. So to answer your question, yeah, compromise is not only possible. The fact is there were compromises made on all sides. Right?
But I've spent 17 years in the Internet Engineering Task Force, and I also know exactly how the ITF, the IESG, and the IAB thinks, and there are certain sort of non-negotiable issues here. The proposal that ITU technical recommendations be mandatory was unacceptable, flat out, never. Not now, not ever. The other thing is we were extremely disturbed about the proposal for mandatory conformance testing to ITU recommendations as well. I mean, a lot of the vendor community was extremely upset about these things. And one of the other, again, I'm afraid I'm going to have to say this is non-negotiable, which is the IETF, the Internet Architecture Board, and the IESG is adamant to preserve, protect, and defend the integrity of the IANA Protocol Parameter Registry, which is an attempt by ITU to write into that registry in some way, shape, or form is unacceptable and would have consequences, including a declaration by the IETF that it would become non-authoritative. And that's very, very serious in terms of the pure engineering issue.
Richard, so which of the issues, so in the presentation this morning, Malcolm talked about the the World Telecommunications Standard Assembly, which was 2 weeks prior to the World Conference on International Telecommunications. You know, the proposal to make ITU recommendations mandatory was dropped. That's not there.
Right.
That was part of the discussion in the process. The question that you're asking about, you know, the testing and so on, that was a WTSA issue, not a WICIT issue. I mean, so again, I think we have to just make it clear the kinds of things we're talking about in which form. And I agree with you, there's some of the things that were proposed at the WTSA that would not be acceptable to vendors, including Cisco, and that, you know, these standards need to be voluntary.
Right.
But, you know, again, I think that these provisions, unless I missed something, to make the recommendations mandatory, that is not either part of the ITRs or part of a resolution.
It will come back. You know,
well, it will come back as a debate, but the process is there. And that is exactly and precisely why we cannot defund the ITU. Every country has to participate.
Bob, I agree with you. The proposal by some hotheads in the United States to defund ITUT really is flat out stupid. That's the only way I can put it. And I certainly don't support it. I don't think any of the rational engineering community supports it one way or the other. And it's very, very, very bad.
It'd be counterproductive.
Absolutely.
Can we go on? Okay, so thank you for your patience, but could we go on to Professor Murai and Mr. Wilson? Then I think it's done. So thank you for your patience.
Actually, responding to the question, and also, I have a question to you know, Malcolm. Was basically, yes, you know, this is, you know, we couldn't achieve the consensus in the WCIT at this point, right? And then, you know, a lot of discussion this afternoon is, you know, kind of mentioning about the kind of, you know, requesting the better understanding about what the issue is going to be. And then, you know, by the member state people participating on the WCIT process. And it's you know, identifying the specific problems and then, you know, understanding what the problems is, you know, is going to be very important. So the question is there any room and the space to do that for the future of the, you mentioned about the kind of signing more member states going to be signing on the specific documentation. That's possible. That's what you said, right? And then, you know, how is it relating to the process of understanding and then sharing the states of the internet and other things could be, you know, happening for the member states? Is there any rooms for the member states to share the wisdom about the future of the internet?
Thank you. And quick comment, please, Mr. Wilson.
Yeah, I think I was in Dubai for WICIT. I think there was a lot of confusion in both during the meeting and beforehand about what was actually going to be discussed. And it would have been, this may be an impossible ask, but it would have been an improvement all around if there'd been some certainty about what the agenda was going to be and how far it could go. I mean, and it may be an impossible ask because these things are in the hands of member states, and even the Secretary General's own declaration that WICIT would have nothing to do with the internet or with the internet governance was something that I'm afraid he couldn't fulfill, because of course the meeting is in the hands of member states. And I think that's a sort of a side issue, because what we've had is another UN process, the one I described before of the WSIS, which said with unanimous agreement, I think, that internet governance should be addressed in another mode, and it should be addressed specifically through the IGF, which has been now proven as a functioning, worthwhile activity, and that's where internet governance should be. So I think one of the clarifications that is needed and that we need to stick to is where exactly are these discussions going to happen, and can they just simply go on and on in two different forums, and two forums which I might say, in spite of the changes which were made for Wicket, they still do have very different modalities in terms of who can participate and how open the information is, and how you can actually have any real access to proceedings. And I think the IGF is designed specifically to allow those things. It's designed specifically to answer the mandate that was created by the UN itself, and that's where these things should be happening.
Thank you much. Sorry, I think we ran out of time. I was going to ask Dr. Pepper to wrap up, but so we ran out of time. So is it okay? Thank you for your patience and your patience for my mismanagement of the time. We're 20 minutes late already. Thank you, and please join me applaud the distinguished panelists, please. I had some nasty questions, but